So today we're back on Anime Expeditions, and in my last video, I saw a few comments about the best traits to roll on people, and also the best equipment builds to run. So that's exactly what we're talking about today. I hope you guys found the video helpful. If you do, maybe leave a like or subscribe. But anyways, let's get into it. Alright, hello guys. So this video is pretty much going to be just a tier list video. I apologize for some details being a little bit scuffed. I can't put the icons like in the exact tier label, for example. But pretty much for the most part, I have all the important relics in the game here, and then I have the units placed down next to them. There are 2 icons for each unit, so there's like 2 Yutas on this list, for example. One here, 2 Megumis, for example, 1 here, 1 here. So pretty much you can use this as a cheat sheet. Okay, look for the 2 icons of the unit you're looking for. And if I'm looking for like Ichigo, right, I'm going to look at Ichigo here, look at Ichigo here. That means I need to give him the Shinigami sword and the enhanced katana. You can just kind of look at this and run the builds I have here, and it should be the best damage on them. But I do also want to talk about a few things in this video, because, you know, I'm not just going to show you tier lists and not really explain them. So pretty much now I'm going to explain my rankings, so like why I didn't use some of the equipment here, or why I put stuff where they are. If you don't really care, there are timestamps in the description to skip to the trait tier list. But first up with the Shinigami sword, I want to kind of explain. This is pretty much the biggest damage increase on like any unit. It gives you 10% crit chance, 5% damage, and up to 15% more damage from its passive. The way I look at it is like, okay, even if you have no enemies in your range and you don't get much damage from the 15% buff or whatever, not having enemies in your range means you didn't really need the buff anyway, because like you're killing everything, you know? So for like 90% of the units in this game, this is the best equipment to run on them. Not every unit though, because some are like more inclined to scale off raw damage, for example, so like Flame Emperor and Hollow. These guys are based on burn, so they pretty much want full damage because Dot can't crit. But if you have any unit that can crit and wants damage, Shinigami Sword's pretty much the best relic. The only case where it could really be outperformed on these guys is like if there's a boss in their range, for example, because then the boss only gives you 1% damage from the passive and still needs a lot more damage to be killed. But overall, yeah, Shinigami Sword is the best relic here, and these are the units you want to put it on. The 3 Swords from Hell are the second best equipment for pure damage. You get a flat 15% damage increase. So it's really good on a lot of units that scale off of pure damage. For example, like Kenpachi has his aura passive, all his follow-ups, they kind of want raw damage. Puppet has his summons, Toymaker has her summons. All these units kind of just want raw damage, and that's why the 3 Swords from Hell are so great on them. Enhanced Katana is for crit. So Yuta, for example, I've made a couple videos on this guy and why you want to build crit on him, because he's more of a support if you run crit, and he's really good. You want the follow-up tags to be critting. Ichigo, you want to kind of ramp up his passive with the SPA reduction from critting. And then True Saint Holy, her whole thing is kind of crit, so you kind of want to play into it. I don't really see a point in using this unit other than kind of similar to Yuta. She can like use her ability to take other people's damage, and then she can crit with it if you build her for crit. So, I don't know. These 3 units right here you want to build a lot of crit on. The Magic Book. Pretty much any magic unit that can use this relic should use it. There are some exceptions maybe with like units that really scale off their pure damage stat, like for example if I want my Yuta to copy my Frieren. Frieren having the 20% magic buff or whatever isn't going to be copied by Yuta, so like I'd rather just give her 15% damage, if that makes sense. Like this relic doesn't actually change your damage stat, so with stuff where you want your damage stat to matter, like if you're having Yuta scale off them, then you don't want to run the magic book. But on paper, if you're not using these guys as like statistics for other people, and you just care about their personal DPS, you definitely want to run the magic book. Because to my knowledge, if I'm not wrong, the magic book is applied like on top of everything you already do. So it's like a 20% multiplier on top of your damage output, and it's really strong. Now the reason we don't run like physical damage multiplier is because their multiplier stats are just kind of lower. Like these max out at 10% physical damage, 10% physical damage, whereas you can just run like 15% damage or a bunch of crit and a bunch of damage from Shinigami Sword. I do think you can make the case for like maybe Hollow Blaze having Katana. Like there are some units out there that might want Katana. I don't know, there's like a couple cases where I might be off by maybe like 2 to 5% on DPS output. So take things of course with a grain of salt, but I think these rankings are pretty accurate for the most part. I did a lot of math for this. The Kunai Relic is good for SPA reduction, so here we have like 3 debuffers for example. These guys want to be attacking very quickly, but then Kunai is also pretty good for the 10% damage, so that's why Toymaker is in here, that's why Hollow Blaze is in here. And Lady Giant also wants like a mix of damage and SPA. You know, these 3 right here just kind of want the balanced stat bonuses from this one. Accursed Equipment is purely SPA reduction, so I kind of run this on like my debuffers and that's about it. Red Finger is for bleed, so you could make the case of running this on Yuta, but I don't know, if you get with the times and run a crit Yuta build, it's just way better. Okay, but bleed units are pretty good with the Red Finger. Goso is pretty good with it, it's kind of like his whole thing. Then Pirate Slingshot and Magic Orb right now are just kind of the best ones for range, so I run these on like my buffers, Utahime and Himmel. But overall, these should be pretty accurate. If you have any questions about why I put stuff where they are, like for example, one question I got is why we don't build crit on every unit. And really the answer to why we don't just build everyone crit, because crit is really good in this game, is because Most of the time, units have like passives that scale off damage. For example, Lady Giant has her stone walls and follow-ups. This guy has burn, this guy has burn. This guy has cocoon that scales off his damage. He also has bleed. Pretty much most units in this game don't really have anything that incentivizes crit rather than just building damage. On paper, there are like a lot of units that, especially 3 placements or more, perform like maybe 5 to 10% more DPS if you run them crit builds, with like Forsaken and crit relics on them. But the 10% DPS difference doesn't make up for the cost efficiency, cost effectiveness of just running them unbound, because you only have to max out 1. That's another thing, like when we're thinking about builds to run on these people, we have to account for how much they cost to max out, whether or not they need to be maxed out. So like for example, Doflamingo and Yuta are units that are kind of DPS support hybrids that I don't really consider needing to be maxed out, and you want to have multiple placements of them. But I don't know, for a few reasons, a lot of the units in this game want to run unbound and just pure damage builds. There was quite a bit of math on my end that went into these rankings, and I tested a lot of builds and all that, so it's pretty nerdy. I don't want to talk about it all here. But if you have any other questions about my rankings, feel free to let me know in the comments down below, and I will try to answer those. Anyway, I think I've done enough yapping for this section. I don't know, don't be afraid to just blindly trust the builds I have on here, because I tested these out, and they're pretty accurate. Moving on to the trait tier list, once again, a little bit scuffed. Sorry for not being able to put the icon on the actual tier. But pretty much, as you can see, most units want Unbound. Megami wants Unbound, Kenpachi wants Unbound. A lot of units on here in particular for the Unbound category are like 2 placement. These guys want Unbound because the drawback of Unbound doesn't really matter to them because they're 2 placement or lower. Frieren just wants Unbound for cost-efficient DPS. I'd say the same thing kinda can apply to Ichigo and Doflamingo. Or if you want to have just like pure cost-effective DPS on these guys, you run Unbound on them. Because maxing out 3 placements of Doflamingo and Ichigo is pretty expensive. I do think Ichigo benefits a lot from having crit, so his best trait is probably Forsaken. But yeah, a lot of units on here you could like argue just kind of want Unbound, you know? But for the other traits I want to talk about as well, so Primordial. Doflamingo and Diane want this because they're 3 or 4 placement and want the SPA reduction, on top of just doing more damage. Primordial's the best on these guys overall, if you want to use them as like well-rounded kind of support and DPS hybrids. She doesn't really have much support, but Doflamingo does with his like cocoon or whatever. If you want to run these guys as like kind of cheap placement, good damage, and some supporting value, this is why you'd run Primordial. Doflamingo is a main DPS, again you can argue for Unbound. For Diane, Primordial really is her best trait overall. Forsaken, we're of course running a crit build on Yuta. I have a couple of videos already talking about why that is the method, but it's very, very strong. Pretty much Yuta's damage doesn't actually matter. A bulk of his damage comes from the passive where he takes other people's damage. So if you place him down by an Unbound unit, he can take their damage, and then you can make that damage crit. And that's overall better than if you tried to run Unbound on Yuta. For True Saint, very similar to Yuta in that regard. Her whole thing is kind of crit, and she has an ability where she takes other people's damage, and the main value of her is allowing their damage to crit, so you want to run crit on her. Ichigo's a little bit different than these two. He's not like always going to be Forsaken preferred, because if you want to run him as a main DPS, I actually do recommend Unbound on him overall. For a couple of reasons that I think I mentioned in the equipment part of the tier list. I probably should have mentioned that in this part instead. But pretty much for a lot of units, we need to worry about their cost effectiveness, or cost efficiency. I don't know what term to use here. I'm not going to Google it, I don't know. We need to think about like, okay, running Forsaken on Ichigo means you need to max out multiple placements of him, which costs a lot of money. Whereas you can just run Unbound and only need to max out 1. That is the argument I'd make for Ichigo, because you could definitely run this guy as your main DPS and run him Unbound. But from a purely DPS standpoint, if you really want to use this guy, which I feel like if you're using Ichigo, you want to kind of optimize his damage output, because he's not the best anyway. You probably do want to run Forsaken on him. And then Flame Emperor and Hollow are pretty straightforward. As we know, these guys have burn, so Draconic with the 50% dot damage amp is going to help them out a lot, especially because they're multi-placement. So Draconic just kind of is their whole thing. I don't know. For Bolt right here, I put my debuffers in this category because like for the most part, you either go for range or SPA on the debuffing units, I don't know, doesn't really matter. If you want to go like full optimization, the ideal trait would be Primordial, so that's one thing to keep in mind for Saiyaman Sorcery. If you do roll this trait on him, keep it, because it is really, really good. You could also run Draconic if you roll it for the cost reduction. I don't know, it doesn't really matter with these like support type of units, so you can kind of just run whatever you roll. I don't know, Bolt is kind of here as like the best trait I'd recommend rolling for. Kind of like the best mix of budget and performance, because you don't want to actually spend like 500 rerolls on these people. Your farms of course need to have Investor, you kind of need this to play the game. And then the 2 damage buffing supports in the game right now kind of just want range. As you know, Himmel and Utahime, every upgrade is going to increase their damage buff, and you just want stuff in their range to be damage buffed. Of course, there is a yellow range trait, which gives like 25%. I don't have the icon for it, but if you can roll the yellow range trait, I would. The thing is though, is like most of the time, I don't want people to be rolling Unbound on these units by like just kind of over-investing. It really isn't worth dropping like 30 rerolls on these guys or like 50. I think overall, if you can just get range 2, just keep range 2 on these guys, because like you don't really want to over-invest in your support units, because that's kind of how I ended up with Unbound and Ice Mage. It wasn't very fun. Well, that's going to be all for the tier list on the best builds to run. Hopefully this answers some of you guys' questions. I saw a lot of comments about it. And hopefully my yapping in this video was also pretty helpful with information. If you made it this far into the video, you are probably like one of the 1%. So, I don't know, maybe throw a little something something in your comments. I'm not sure what, but either way, thank you to my channel members for making the video possible. You guys are the best. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Hope to see you in the next one. Have a great day.